here kicking this thing off.
Okay.
All right. Hey, everybody. Glad to have you here with us. We're here with Dr. Craig Evans, one of the leading New Testament and Jesus scholars in the world. He has a fascinating new book called Jesus and the Manuscripts, which is a massive contribution to historical Jesus studies. Dr. Evans teaches at Houston Baptist University, kind of a brother or sister school to Biola Apologetics. Thanks so much for coming on and joining us.
Good to be with you, Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me start by asking you, tell me what's unique in your approach in this book, Jesus and the Manuscripts.
What I wanted to do was simply to assess all of the manuscript evidence from antiquity. And of course, that's defining antiquity a little bit loosely, all the way from the first century. Conceivably, there might be something written down that refers to Jesus, and then advancing forward until about the time of the Quran. Most of the evidence I look at is second, third, fourth century, but I wanted to include some interesting traditions that are not Christian that talk
Mm-hmm.
about Jesus. And so that's what I wanted to do. And of course, I'm defining manuscripts rather loosely. Yes, mostly papyrus and parchment, but I do look at inscriptions and inscriptions on metal, inscriptions in stone, on ceramic, as well as the more conventional writing things. And so I wanted to look at Christian manuscripts themselves that are in the canon. And so manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the oldest New Testament manuscripts. But I also wanted to, because a lot of people don't know much about Jesus outside the New Testament, and very much a manuscript approach. And so I think it's unique in that sense, the approach that I've taken. And some of it, too, the reason I wanted to get into this is a lot of it's brand new. One of the reasons the book took a while to finish is because stuff kept happening. And I thought, oh, good, I'll be done next year. And then, boom, something else comes along. And then
Mm-hmm.
something else is being discussed. And so I finally just had to say, that's it. And even when it was in the press, and Jonathan Klein of Hendrickson, such a good copy editor, and I do mention him by name in the preface, I would send him something. Is there any way I can insert, three more sentences? And he'd say, sure. And so right up until finally we had the proofs, I was adding stuff and interacting with stuff. So it's a lively topic. Uh, More stuff. The book will be out of date in just a couple years because papyri continue to be
Wow.
published. Yeah, and things continue to be found. And so it's a very exciting field.
Well, I've got a ton of questions for you, but tell me some of the things that would be considered like breaking news that are coming out recently that were people were just not aware of months or even years ago.
Well, like a lot of people missed the Jesus cup, the magician's cup. We think somebody inscribed Christ on a magician's cup that was probably 200 years old when Jesus' name was added, we think in the middle of the first century. And so Jesus has a reputation as a healer, and so people are scratching his name into magical formula, incantations and charms, things like that. We have a scandal we might get to if we talk about the Gospel of Jesus's wife. I mean, I thought I knew all there was to know on that topic, and then an investigative reporter finally brought his book out quite literally just weeks ago, and I just read it the previous weekend. I'm reviewing it, and there's just out and out fraudulent science involved. The scandal is worse on that one than I realized. So it just doesn't stop.
Well, I definitely want to get to some of these scandals. And one of the things I appreciate about your book, again, for those watching Jesus and the Manuscripts, is you tell some of the stories behind these facts. It's not just facts related to the manuscripts and the historical Jesus. So let's start with one of the earliest manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus. And there's a fascinating story behind this. And this is one of the earliest manuscripts we have. So what's the significance of this manuscript and the story behind it?
Well, a guy named Konstantin Tischendorf, a German, back in the 1830s and 40s, he became a Bible hunter. That's how Stan Porter, in his book on Tischendorf, describes him. He had good instincts. He knew where to go. And of course, monasteries were places he wanted to go. And by the way, that's still happening, going to monasteries and finding uncatalogued, unknown books. copies of Scripture and so on. And he went to the St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, which now again belongs to Egypt. And he noticed that some trash was being thrown out and burned, and he became concerned because some of it looked like books and things like that. Of course, it's disputed, the aspects of his story, but it's in that context he discovered most of, not all of, but most of an old codex that, because it was from Sinai, it became known as Codex Sinaiticus, and it contains most of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament, and dates to probably the middle of the 4th century, and that was quite a discovery, and that was in the 1840s. It's disputed to this day about whether or not it was rightly purchased or borrowed or stolen or whatever from the monastery, but it's in the British Library to this day. I've seen it. I've looked right at it. And you're looking at a time when Christianity had just become legalized in the Roman Empire. So that's going way back, and that's very exciting.
So how many manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd century of any of the New Testament texts or the Gospels?
Well, we have dozens of manuscripts. I mean, it's disputed how many we have from the 2nd century. Most allow that we have 3, 4, 5. Some put the number as high as 10, 12. And then we have a whole bunch of manuscripts, dozens, that are 3rd century. And then, of course, the numbers just keep multiplying when you go on into the 4th century. So that's a pretty good manuscript record. What it basically means is we have the entire Greek text, the entire text of the Greek New Testament, only about 150 to 200 years removed from when those writings were written. And that stacks up against just about everything else from late antiquity, the Greco-Roman world. So it's an excellent record of, and of course, it's just numerous manuscripts. When it's not just 3 or 4, but dozens, and then eventually hundreds, and eventually thousands, you can do the comparison and collation, and it helps you ferret out scribal errors, lapses, places where the text seems corrupt or confused. And to the point that in Bruce Metzger's estimation, there are only a handful of lines where we have a word where we're just not sure, is that the original word? And that's out of 20,000. If you count the lines in the New Testament the way they typically would be counted in a 550-page Greek New Testament long ago. And so to have only a few lines where there's any question at all out of 20,000, that's not bad. And as Metzger and others have pointed out, the particular lines in question have no impact or bearing on any significant Christian teaching. So the idea that, oh my gosh, we have no idea what Jesus taught, we don't know what his apostles taught, we're in the fog, we just don't know, there is no basis for saying that.
Now, you've debated Bart Ehrman, I think 5 times on this topic. And one of the approaches that he takes is that if there's 150 years before we have, say, this entire Greek text, that's a lot of time for intentional and unintentional error. Yet you argue in this book, you say we don't have good reason to believe there was significant redaction during that time. Why wasn't there?
A lot of good reasons for that. One of them is, and this goes to motive, and often behind the question is motive. Some scribe, oh, I don't like what's being said about Jesus. I want to bump up the Christology a little bit. And so he makes a change. The problem with that kind of thinking, it's anachronistic. It assumes that the 4th century Christological sensitivities, say expressed at the Council of Nicaea, where Christians got together and said, this is what we believe is the true teaching about Jesus Christ, Christology. Well, how in the world would a scribe at the end of the 1st century or beginning of the 2nd century know that? How would he know, well, this is the direction Christology needs to go? The irony here is in the 2nd century, various Gnostic groups were emerging who, in fact, wanted to bump the Christology way up and deny Jesus's humanity. And so the idea of denying Jesus's humanity, to make him more godlike or something like that, that wasn't actually in the mix. How would anyone in the 2nd century know how this was going to get resolved? And here's the next question. How would anyone know in the 2nd century what's going to be in the New Testament?
Hmm.
I mean, it really is naive that that idea that there's these secret scribes sneaking around in the second century, changing the text to get it to sound more orthodox. That
Hmm.
is so dumb on so many levels. They don't know which books are going to be in a New Testament. They don't know there's going to be a New Testament. So they
Hmm.
don't know which books are going to win the day, so to speak, and become, quote, orthodox. And then, of course, they have no idea how they ought to be changed. And so that's really dumb. Then there's a third thing that comes into play. And the evidence suggests that most of these scribes in the first and second centuries were, in fact, professional scribes. That's what they did for a living. You and I can pick up a pen and start writing. You and I can type away at a keyboard, turn on spell checker. We could end up with a pretty clean manuscript really quickly. That's not the way it was then. And so it was specialized training to know how to prepare a pen, make your ink, acquire and prepare papyrus, and write out a manuscript. So the idea that just any old buddy could start writing something out is really silly.
Hmm.
And so these are trained professional scribes, which means most of them weren't even Christians.
Hmm.
So they're not thinking, whoa, this is the Gospel of Matthew. I need to work on it and improve it. They're not thinking that. So for three good reasons, there is no motive for these kinds of things that some people like to say, that all kinds of changes are taking place. But then, of course, there's another big surprise, nothing to do with motive, and that has to do with the longevity of the original
Hmm.
writings themselves and the very earliest copies. So in other words, you could have the original, you could have a first generation copy, in fact, several first generation copies over a period of years. What we have found is that books, of course, were valuable and treasured and kept a long time. Books, today we throw away paperbacks, they get read once, the spine cracks, we toss it in the trash. That isn't the way books were handled in antiquity. And so we have solid evidence, testimonial, but also actual evidence from stratigraphy, where the archaeologists find books that they can date at a certain century, and they find them in a layer 300 years later. Herculaneum, for example, the house of the papyri there when Vesuvius exploded and buried the town. So we have this library still in use, and the books are 300 years old when the library got carbonized. And so what we find is that there's no reason to think that these manuscripts weren't around for at least 100 years, maybe 150. The Gospel of John, we're told, was around for 200 years, the original. And of course, what they did with autographs, and again, we know this from testimony, both secular and Christian, that autographs were treasured and
Hmm.
studied to make sure that the copy one had was accurate. And so if the autographs are around for 100, 150, maybe 200 years, as Tertullian says and others and secular people say about their secular writings, then this means that the text of the New Testament would be very stable. So when you add that all up, no motive to make changes, and then we've got the originals hanging around a long time, venerated and studied. It's no wonder that when we get into the third century and have ample manuscript evidence that we don't see any signs of serious textual dislocations. And that's what scholars have noted. If the changes were made, why don't we see any evidence of that when we get into the third century?
Is this one of the new pieces of evidence that's really come out of your research and other scholarship recently, how long these autographs last? And I ask because if that's right, they last a century, 150, sometimes 200 years. People are writing in the third century, and there's good reason to believe the autographs were still around. Is that fair,
Yeah.
or is that overstating the evidence?
No, that's not overstating it at all. And Christianity was not enormous, and the number of serious scholars and scribes were not, it wasn't like there were hundreds and hundreds of Christian professors in the second century or something like that. It was a relatively small club of seriously academic people who were gathering manuscripts, making comparisons, making
Hmm.
copies too. And they went out of their way to get these things. They wanted to do it. How new is this research? It's about a decade.
Wow.
There was a classicist, George Houston. He's retired now. He taught classics for years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, ironically, where Bart Ehrman is. And his interest in the latter part of his career was simply on book culture in the Greco-Roman world. What kind of books did Greeks and Romans collect? Roman elite, what did they have in their libraries? What kind of stuff did they like to read? How costly was it to make a copy of a book? And, on and on and he
Sure.
went. And then what happened was, in doing his research, he was startled to notice the stratigraphy that was reported in Egypt by Grenfell and Hunt, the two great papyrologists that unearthed tens and tens and hundreds of thousands of papyri at Oxyrhynchus. He knows, just as almost an aside, my goodness, these books were in use a long time. They're 200, 300 years old before they're tossed out. I guess that shows you how valuable they were.
Hmm.
When I saw that, I began communicating with him. That's what launched a series of studies, myself. And he hadn't even thought about religious books. He hadn't even looked at biblical things. The light went on. I realized, look at Qumran. Some of the Bible scrolls at Qumran were 200 and 300 years old
Wow.
when the Romans destroyed Qumran in the first century AD. And those books had not been retired. They were still being read. And they were 250, 300 years old. And the evidence among Christians, same thing. So books were around a long time. They were used for comparative purposes, and that stabilized the text. In other words, the idea of somebody changing a text in enough places, enough texts, in enough languages, in enough regions to truly change the text that you and I now have is simply impossible.
That's amazing. That's remarkable that scholarship is coming out. And by the way, I absolutely love your enthusiasm. We're getting a little bit of feedback on the mic. I think it's as you move, it might be scratching a little bit. So there we go. I think that'll help a little bit. Don't tone down the enthusiasm. Just protect the mic. We're gonna get to some of these stories. I want to ask you about some of these forgeries that are just crazy. But two questions first. Number one, you say, quote, there's no evidence the Gospels ever circulated anonymously. Why do you say that so strong in your recent book?
Well, there are two main reasons for it. Number one is more of an inference, and that is there's never any dispute about who wrote them. So you don't have two, three names trotted out for Matthew, or a couple of names for Mark, or a couple of names for Luke. And the Mark one is especially interesting because there is the tradition that connects Peter to it. And yet everybody says it's the gospel according to Mark. And the temptation, you would think, if you were open to being very loose with the evidence and you were driven by apologetic interests, and why not just call it the gospel according to Peter? But no, they call it Mark, and that's because the tradition that it was Mark who wrote it is early and very strong. The other thing, though, is more of an evidentiary nature, and that is thanks to the discovery of some writings by Galen that had been lost until 2005, thanks to a new consideration of Lucian of Samosata in his book on how to write history, we now realize that books that were put in order, edited, and ready for publication never were issued anonymously. So why would we believe the Gospels were issued anonymously and when other writings weren't? And of course, there's no dispute about who wrote them. So those two items go hand in hand. That's why I think we really should say a heavy burden of proof rests on anybody who says, "Oh, the Gospels, nobody knew who wrote them. They just circulated from the beginning anonymously." I think that is simply incorrect, and we need to stop saying that because it's very likely false.
That's a real powerful response. For those who just joined us, we're talking with Dr. Craig Evans. Has a book coming out very soon. You can pre-order it on Amazon called Jesus and the Manuscripts. And it's a fascinating contribution. I hope you'll get the historical Jesus studies. Now, one more question before we jump into some of these controversial forgery stories is, do we have good reason to believe that the apostles would have taken notes during the life and ministry of Jesus?
Yeah, that's exactly what we learn. Papias is the one who told us that originally, and unfortunately, his five-volume work doesn't
Mm-hmm.
survive. It's not extant, but there are numerous quotations. Eusebius and Irenaeus. Eusebius is a fourth-century Christian historian. Irenaeus, late second-century Christian apologist and theologian, and they quote some key passages. And one of the things he says is that Peter presented the teachings of Jesus in these pithy, short anecdotes that the ancients called crai, useful
Mm-hmm.
illustrations. And Mark wrote down as many of them as he could remember, but not in order. And what he wrote down were notes. And so what it leads me to conclude, and I argue for this and at the beginning of my book that's coming out, is that these are the notes, these Petrine notes that lie behind all three gospels, especially Mark,
Hmm.
which relies heavily on them. But Matthew and Luke also made use of it. So it's a Petrine apostolic tradition written out as notes. And this is the same language Galen uses. He says, yeah, I have all these notes, and no, they're not in order. They're not ready for publication, but it's the basis of my later publications. And that's what Lucian says too. And it would appear that the second century Christian tradition understood the Gospels the same way, and for good
Mm.
reason.
That's a great response. Let's jump into some of these stories that I honestly was blown away when I read some of the background in your book, Craig. It just, I couldn't believe it. It sounded like a Dan Brown novel, which you reference a couple times. Let's talk about the story behind what's called the Gospel of Jesus's wife. Is there good reason to think that he was married in this gospel? Does it have any historical value? But first off, what is the story even behind this?
Oh, this thing's embarrassing. I'm not going to mention her name. It's a professor at Harvard. I'll just leave her out. It's so embarrassing. But she was deceived by a con artist, a very dishonest individual. In any case, it's a fake. The papyrus is genuine, stolen along with many other papyri from Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy. Anybody can do it. If you have access to a room where papyri are kept, you have boxes of papyrus fragments that have little or no writing. They're not cataloged. People don't even know they're there. They're not even recorded. And to pick up a few of these and slip away with them isn't difficult. And so that's what he did when he was a graduate student in the early 90s. And so several papyri stolen, nobody even knows. And then with his crude attempt, he writes out some broken lines of Coptic on this fragment, and in it Jesus says, my wife. And
Mm.
so that's what created all this hubbub, and this was shown to this Harvard professor 2010. She said, no, I don't want to publish it in 2011. Then for mysterious reasons she suddenly changed her mind. She published it in 2012, and tests were made, and people said, this isn't a good idea, it's probably fake. Sean, I've looked at hundreds of papyri. The ink is always dull. It may
Mm.
be a dull grayish black, but it looks dusty. It may have turned brown. It depends on what it's made out of, if it has iron in it or just carbon and so on. But this ink in places is shiny and glossy. And a reporter called me up in 2012, Professor Evans, what do you think about this new fragment called The Gospel of Jesus' Wife? And I said that it's new. In fact, it's not as old as my grandson. And
Mm.
later on, I thought, oh man, maybe I overstated it. No, actually, as it turns out, my grandson was 4 or 5 years old when it was produced. So there, I'm okay. I'm in the
All
clear.
right.
But but it's a fake. And what was shocking is Harvard Theological Review not only published it, but published studies showing it probably is genuine, that it probably is ancient. There's no sign of anything modern. It turned out that the so-called scientists were just personal friends and relatives of the people involved. They have since retracted their own work. So it's a huge embarrassment for Harvard
Mm.
Theological Review, Harvard Divinity School, and for this professor. And it really teaches us something. We just have to take a hard and serious look at things. And of course, the gospel of Jesus' wife was saying what a lot of people wanted to hear, that maybe Jesus had something going with a woman. And that's been in vogue. It's been in vogue for 40 years, since Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bajan. It went through the roof in 2003 when Da Vinci Code came out, and in 2006 when the movie came out. So that's what's behind this, and so it's a fake from the get-go.
One of the other gospels that you talk about is the Gospel of Philip, where there's a reference potentially to Jesus kissing or being married to Mary. Is that even a proper interpretation of the gospel? And if so, would this have any historical merit?
Well, no on both scores.
Hmm.
Number one, the Gospel of Philip doesn't teach romance between Jesus and Mary or any other woman. And if it's read carefully and understood in context, you realize that. Jesus loves his disciples. disciples kissed Jesus. Judas Iscariot, remember, kissed Jesus. So that we're not used to that. The idea of a man walking up to another man and kissing him would be considered a little strange. We tend to connect romance and erotica and so on to kissing. That wasn't the way it was in antiquity. So the message of the Gospel of Philip is not Jesus and Mary are married or having a physical relationship or producing children or anything. That's not what it taught at all. But what's interesting is this professor at Harvard published an article on that, and at the end of it said, what we need is a text that actually says that she's his wife, and Shazam. The text materializes, made to order, and Jesus says, "My wife." And what's funny about it, there's mistakes in it. Even the wrong spelling for wife is there, and it's a number of goofs that just didn't get caught. The whole text and is based on a Gospel of Thomas that somebody put online, complete with mistakes that carried over into this fraud. And it should have been caught early on. So the Gospel of Philip doesn't mean that. The Gospel of Mary doesn't mean that. All those Gospels are saying, and they're genuine from the 2nd or 3rd century. They're not modern fakes. But all they're trying to say is that Mary had a prominent place among the disciples, and she got the best teaching that anybody got. That's all it's trying to say.
You've examined amulets. You've examined fragments, early manuscripts. Is there any good evidence to believe that Jesus was married?
None whatsoever. In fact, the church fathers in the 2nd century who talk about it, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clement, and some others, late 2nd, early 3rd, the reason they bring it up is not because it's controversial. It's because there are issues about whether or not people in full-time ministry ought to be single. And so as an aside, they say, well, Jesus wasn't married, so maybe that's an example there. It wasn't required yet, as it would in the Roman Church centuries later, but that's how it comes up. It isn't because there's controversy that somebody's running around or that the Gnostics are running around saying Jesus is married. That isn't even an issue. The only reason it gets mentioned is because, is Jesus an example for others to follow? Well, it's true. He wasn't married. Maybe we shouldn't be married too. And others said, no. That's just Jesus. He was special. There's nothing wrong with getting married. And that was the conversation happening at the end of the 2nd century.
That's really interesting. When I studied the fate of the apostles, some of the early inscriptions and writings I found weren't asking the historical question, but made the point as an aside, observing something else, and then helped me answer the question. It sounds like the same thing with the historical Jesus. Was he actually married? Let me ask you this. How about, so one of the controversies was that Jesus was married. We see no good early evidence for that. Another one that people have been talking about recently is that Jesus was gay. And there's a whole controversy surrounding this that fascinated me from the late Morton Smith, an alleged letter that was found from Clement of Alexandria suggesting this. Can you unpack this story for us and then your conclusions about it?
Sure, I can. And the idea, by the way, just if we want to be historical for a moment, of Jesus being gay would have been quite just beyond scandal for his time. And so what we're doing is we're taking the late 19th century, 20th century sensitivities and running it back into the 1st century. Folks, that isn't going to work. If there had been the least hint or suspicion on the part of Jesus' followers, family, friends, enemies, anybody, you name it, that Jesus was gay, he would be destroyed. He'd have no ministry. He'd have no following. It wouldn't get out of the gate. No, this is all a modern infatuation that's going on. In fact, secret mark, Morton Smith says he found it 1958 at the Marsaba Monastery, where he had visited when he was in Israel many years before, and he wanted to go back and check out some of its old books. So he says he found it. He spent about 2 weeks at the monastery cataloging a bunch of old writings, a few old books, and he finds this book, and in the end papers, what should be blank end papers, in a 17th century collection of apostolic fathers, he finds the equivalent of about 2.5 pages handwritten Greek, monastic style, Greek style writing that is supposedly a letter of Clement. We have no letters by Clement of Alexandria, so this would be the only one, addressed to somebody named Theodore, talking about something that needs to be hush hush and kept secret, a longer version of Mark, and he actually quotes two passages from it. One of them is very controversial, where a young man who, like Lazarus, who's been raised from the dead, comes to Jesus at night wearing, and this is what it says, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body,
Hmm.
and goes, and Jesus then teaches him the mysteries of the kingdom of God. And then this letter goes on to say it's outrageous. Some people think that this implies something that's lascivious and immoral and blasphemous. It doesn't say naked man with naked man. So just in case you failed to pick up on the homoerotic potential, it comes right out and says it does not say naked man with naked man.
Hmm.
So that makes it really clear. Oh, that's what's really going on. That's why, it sounds kind of, I mean, wouldn't it be weird, Sean, if somebody said, I saw Professor McDowell and he was only wearing his t-shirt and his trousers and his shoes over his naked body. I mean, it's a
Sure.
redundancy. You don't need to say that, but it's said to get something in your mind, and then it gives the opportunity for Clement to then express scandal. And then he goes on to say, it is true, but deny it's true. Don't let anybody know. And so he confirms the truth of the rumor. And of course, that's not exactly how you put the kibosh on some rumor. So he acknowledges that it's true. And of course, the whole thing just stinks. Morton
Hmm.
Smith says he found it. Now, I don't think he did at all. Why? Because in publications prior to 1958, he already knows about the discovery. He's already saying odd things that he would later find in this document he says he found in 1958. And most scholars think that it's rubbish. They think it's based on a novel by James Hunter called The Marsaba Mystery, where the same thing happens just before World War II. And there's a well-known novel by a gay man from Britain named Angus Wilson, and it's a similar plot there. And that novel came out in 1956. So the
Interesting.
two novels together seem to provide, and that's newish. I'm not sure there's been much discussion of the second novel by Angus Wilson. And so I talk about both novels. And there's one more. There's clear evidence of modern perspectivalism in Secret Mark. And so Clement is telling Theodore, you need to know that not all truth is true. There's
Huh.
true truth, and then there's this other. Nobody said that. You cannot find with TLG, that's this search engine for Greek from antiquity. Nobody in antiquity ever refers to true truth. That shows up in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I actually quote a novel that appeared in the 1889 or something like that, where a character is complaining over a broken romance, and she says, "You need to know that not all truth is true." And
Hmm.
it's just like it's a page right out of, well, it's Morton Smith. So there are a lot of modern indicators in that work.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you say in the book, you say that some people actually defend that some scholars defend this may be legitimate, but it sounds like most are moving away from that and take
I
the
think so.
position you hold. They are.
I
Okay.
think so. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how people respond to these arguments. Um, I don't know. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife and Secret Mark, these two sexual documents together, have been defended by the same group, and they defended the Gospel of Jesus' Wife right up to the very end until the forger was identified, and then
Hmm.
they finally gave up on that one.
Do you think we're going to see a lot more forgeries moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. We've got, the forged Dead Sea Scroll fragments that were very skillfully done, using the correct ink formula on authentic ancient Dead Sea Scroll leather. Um, I don't, we've had stolen papyrus out of Oxford. That's a scandal. It's a shame. People, they act unethically. And when somebody's out there willing to pay you a king's ransom for a text, the temptation is enormous.
Hmm.
So yeah, to answer your question, I think we're going to have more forgeries and or authentic texts that are given crazy wrong interpretations. I think
Hmm.
there's more to come. Yeah.
So, talk to me a little about your conclusions on the Gospel of Thomas. For a long time, this was peddled as equivalent to the Gospels, sometimes earlier than the canonical Gospels. You date it into late second century and don't conclude that it has much independent historical merit from the canonical Gospels. What's your basic reason why you come to that conclusion?
Several reasons. Number one, the author is familiar with half of the writings of the New Testament. And to try to reverse the evidence and say it just shows you
Mm.
that half of the writings are familiar with Thomas, that doesn't work because Thomas isn't referred to by anybody till the third century. And I've debated this point with Stephen Patterson. I respect Stephen. He's a good scholar. He did his PhD at Claremont, as I did. And we've had friendly dialogue on this. And he wants to argue that Thomas was composed in the 70s, and so it's about as old as, say, Matthew and Luke or something like that. But my reply to him is, well, Steve, how do you explain then Matthew and Luke are being quoted and talked about within one generation? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, everybody knows about them by the end of the first century, beginning of the second. How is it that we have to go from the 70s when you say Thomas is written until the 220s? 150 to 60 years later. So it seems to me that Thomas is written later. That's why nobody knows about it till later. Irenaeus wants to talk about all of the extra canonical gospels to show what's wrong with them. He hasn't heard of Thomas yet. And Irenaeus was way out west in France. Well, yeah, okay. But he's talking about gospels that were produced in the East. He knows about them. So Thomas is written, I think, around 180, 185 in through there. The reason for it, too, it isn't just that it's unknown. Thomas knows the New Testament, but Thomas itself is unknown. But it's because he reflects late second century Syrian traditions that are distinctive,
Mm.
including Tatian's Diatessaron, his four gospel harmony, which creates distinctive readings. Some of them are in Thomas. So those are the main reasons for dating Thomas late second.
Is scholarship moving kind of that direction, or is there still some significant scholars that hold out possibly first century date?
I think it's both. I think most
Hmm.
scholars are seeing Thomas as late, uh, but there are still some holdouts. I should mention Simon Gathercole's book a few years ago, and also Mark Goodacre's book. They came out the same year, independent studies. Both of them concluded the same thing. They didn't appeal to the Syrian evidence, but what they appealed to, both of them very effectively, is that every stream of gospel tradition that you have, that is Mark, Q, stuff special to Matthew, M, stuff special to Luke, L. It's all in Thomas.
Hmm.
Redaction, where Luke doesn't like Mark's wording and tinkers with it a little bit, that's in Thomas. So the conclusion's inescapable. Thomas has to be second century. Thomas has to be secondary and dependent on the gospel tradition. And I argue because of the Syrian connections, diatessaron and that kind of thing, you really shouldn't make Thomas any earlier than 180.
Wow. We're talking with Dr. Craig Evans about his new book that is coming out soon called Jesus and the Manuscripts. If you are interested in New Testament studies and the historical Jesus, this is a must read book. One of the things that very much interested me is you talked about the manuscripts of the New Testament, the Gospels, you compared them with manuscripts for the Quran. How does manuscript study for the Quran compare with manuscript study to the New Testament?
Yeah, a very interesting point of comparison. Whereas Christian scholars are eager to get involved in textual criticism, eager to find more manuscripts and compare them and note the discrepancies and that kind of thing. I mean, Dan Wallace, he's added dozens to our list. He's going to keep looking for more. And that's really good. I think that's a great thing. The more evidence is better. Unfortunately, in the history of Islam, there's been a tendency to destroy what are considered defective manuscripts. And what's feared, and I was acquainted with the work of the late Keith Small, who was an expert on
Mm-hmm.
this topic, and Keith produced a very fine book. The challenge now is how do you do Quranic textual textual criticism if much of the older material has been destroyed. It would be like us going back as Christian scholars and getting rid of all the papyri, getting rid of Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, only keeping the later Byzantine tradition, only keeping the so-called Textus Receptus or something like that, and then realizing, uh-oh, I think we made a mistake. Oops, but we've destroyed our evidence. Uh, Fortunately, some manuscripts have been overlooked, and of course, there's the search for more. So maybe Quranic textual criticism can take a step forward, but there's not much interest in doing that, and sometimes even threats against scholars. It's kind, the King James only problem that Christianity sometimes has. Will just ramp that up 100-fold, add some death threats, and you'd get an idea of what it can be
Mm.
sometimes in Quranic studies.
So some of the challenges with New Testament textual criticism is that we have a range of different manuscripts, different languages, different places, different times. We compare them, but you go back to the beginning of the Quran, and there was a concerted effort to destroy all of the other manuscripts and maintain just one line. So it's difficult to have criticism when there's only one line, but you're saying some of these other manuscripts are bubbling up and just allowing us to make some of these initial comparisons. Is that fair?
Yes, that's right. Some manuscripts did survive. The other thing is some manuscripts that have survived that nobody thought was problematic because they've got the text right. Well, guess what? Under ultraviolet, we could see text underneath. So some of these have
Mm.
been amended, and so you get right over. Over the older text that's beneath that reads differently. So some of the manuscripts that survive are some of these so-called defective texts. They just didn't know it. So anyway, it's an interesting issue. Of course, I talk about the Quran in my book, not just because of textual criticism, but because the presentation of Jesus is different. And
Mm.
you get some interesting intersections, the infancy tradition, Jesus in the crib, talking to people, the denial of Jesus's death on the cross, bait and switch. It's somebody else who died on the cross. I mean, that's interesting stuff. And so I wanted to reach out and talk about that. The Gospel of Barnabas, which is a Islamic friendly medieval forgery. And so people need to know about this kind of stuff.
Now, the Gospel of Barnabas is the first account that I'm aware of that Judas was crucified in place of Jesus, and it's appealed to by some Muslim scholars. But the evidence shows it's a late medieval forgery, and there's no earlier precedent for it. Is that
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. What it was, the Quran itself doesn't say it was Judas Iscariot that died on the cross, but it just says it was somebody, it wasn't Jesus. It's somebody else. And then the earliest that I have found is about the year 1000, give or take a few decades.
Okay.
An interpretive scholar said it was Judas Iscariot. Well, the Gospel of Barnabas is probably composed in the 14th century at the earliest, that is the late 1300s, and it, of course, says it's Judas Iscariot. But scholars, critical scholars, don't accept the Gospel of Barnabas because it's so full of errors and it
Mm.
lacks verisimilitude. For example, in the Gospel of Barnabas, the disciples are rowing their boat, and they row their boat all the way to Nazareth. Well, if you know anything about the topography, I can't. These guys should be on the Olympic team. They're rowing a boat over several miles of dry land. Capernaum is on the beach, not Nazareth.
Yes.
And of course, they actually quote Dante's Inferno. That's a bit of a goof too, and that was
Mm.
composed in the 1300s. There are many other mistakes. They think Jesus was born when Pontius Pilate was governor. One passage says Jesus Christ said, "I'm not the Messiah." The author doesn't know that Christ is the word for Messiah, so it says Jesus Christ said, "I'm not the Messiah." They're just endless glitches like that. It is clear it's a late text, and the author just doesn't know what he's talking about.
In terms of the historical questions and some of the manuscript questions that are raised, if we were going to apply the same criticism that we've seen to the Gospels and the New Testament over the past century and a half or so to the Quran, what do you suspect that we would find?
Well, the Quran would. Oh man, The Quran would be in trouble because when it indulges when it brings over biblical materials, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, sometimes gets these confused. Like when we talk about Miriam, is it Moses' sister or is it Jesus' mother? Well, does it matter?
Hmm.
You get some serious anachronisms and confusion. The author does seem to be familiar with Luke, and probably knows a few other Bible stories. So if it is Muhammad that has written these, and he probably did recite many of these things, and that's what the word Quran means, recitation.
Hmm.
His knowledge of the Bible is second, third hand at best. And
Hmm.
so you get some, and he mixes in with it infancy traditions that have no history behind them at all. Jesus, the little boy who makes clay pigeons fly, or Jesus, the infant wonder who in the cradle can speak and say things. And so you get a strange amalgam of legendary materials, biblical materials. Now, the Quran, though, isn't a historical book. If you read it, you realize it's kind of a combination meditation and argument,
Hmm.
and very little chronology, very little sense of narrative, that kind of thing. But there are statements that are made along the way, comments that are made along the way, dealing with biblical narrative, and almost always there's distortion and confusion.
Now, I remember in 2006, there was like this well crafted publicity campaign in newspapers across the country, blogs, TV shows to talk about the release of the Gospel of Judas. It seems, looking back, that number one, there was just a publicity campaign pushing a narrative. But second, people misinterpreted what Judas meant, and it has less historical value than some people anticipated. Am I right about that? What are your thoughts looking back on this gospel?
Yeah, you're right on every point, Sean. I was involved in it. I was added to the team in 2005. I was part of the big show that was at the National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C. Yeah, it was great. The text was found, the codex was recovered. It had been terribly mishandled, it was badly damaged. That was part of the problem. We only had 85%, we estimated, of the gospel of Judas, probably only 60% or so, give or take, of the entire codex. There were shenanigans going on as well as mishandling, but the National Geographic people, they were above board, and they spent $1 million in getting this thing restored and
Wow.
properly tested. So I give them kudos for that. They didn't do anything wrong. But one of the translators on the team, who was responsible for piecing the text back together, coming up with a coherent Coptic narrative, and then translating it, there he made some very tendentious moves in a few places, and it helped create this idea that the Gospel of Judas was portraying Judas as a hero of some kind, the insightful one, the best of the disciples. That's not true at all. Actually, what I argue in my book, and I think this is the majority view now, all these years later, is that it's a parody. The writer is Gnostic, thinks that Jesus' disciples are morons. The best of a bad lot is Judas, but he's worse than the other ones because guess what? They like Jews stupidly sacrifice animals to the false god, and Judas Iscariot shows a little bit of promise. He can understand some things, but in the end, Jesus tells him, "You will exceed them all." Not in a good way, in a bad way. You will sacrifice this body that I am wearing. And then Jesus leaves the body, ascends into the luminous cloud, and sure enough, Judas betrays this body that's been left behind to the high priests. And so that's what it really is. That's what it's talking about. And Irenaeus and some other church fathers knew about it and were highly critical of it. And so, no, that's how it should be understood. It doesn't tell us anything new that we should know about the historical Judas or Jesus or anybody. The answer is no.
So you have chapters here that are very helpful: Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary. As you assess these, do they retain any unique historical information about Jesus that are any? Let me just leave the question at that. Do they maintain any valuable historical information, or are they more valuable in terms of what critics and others believed in the second, third, and fourth century?
Yeah, the latter. I mean, these
Mm,
writings, anything from antiquity is wonderful to find and to study it. I try to, chastise some scholars on Thomas. Thomas is a beautiful work that tells us about asceticism and elitism and mysticism in the Christian church in Syria in the late second century. You're not doing Thomas any favor by interpreting it in the wrong time and place. It's not first century Palestinian. There is no verisimilitude. As the late Larry Hurtado put it, if all we had was Thomas, would we even know Jesus was Jewish? So Thomas should be interpreted where it belongs.
mm,
And it's late second century Syria, and good on it, and interpret it for what it is. And likewise, and of course, Thomas really isn't Gnostic, but the Gnostic Gospels, like Mary and Philip and Judas, they're interesting in their own right. And so these are expressions given by sectarian sect groups and so on who want to interpret Jesus and the disciples a different way. Fine, let them speak. But to trying to say they reflect the first century or give us new insights about Jesus and Mary, the real Jesus and Mary in the
mhm,
first century, is to push the evidence. And it's not doing the evidence any favor. A document
mm.
should be interpreted in its own time and place, on its terms. We should be fair exegetes and interpret these texts accordingly.
Dr. Craig Evans, your book, Jesus and the Manuscripts, is groundbreaking. I'm grateful for it. It's something I'm going to be pointing back to and using many, many times and referring to people. Let me ask you a final question I'm curious about. You've been studying the historical Jesus for decades. And we'll just leave it at that. We'll just say decades. What,
Okay.
how has this shaped your confidence in the historical Jesus, in the scriptures, having done this and put in so much work and thought for a lot of your career?
Well, it's enriched my understanding of the historical Jesus and his world. Um, it's deep in my faith.
Hmm.
I understand, Jesus and what he was talking about, and the disciples, the questions they had, the fears they faced, that kind of thing. And so I have a much deeper respect for Jesus and these disciples at the very beginning of what would become the Christian church. And the thing that's neat about it, it doesn't get old, it doesn't get stale,
Hmm.
because there's so much more to explore. We're trying to reconstruct a very full three-dimensional view of the first century in Israel in the 20s and the 30s, and in that time and place. And we just keep finding more stuff. That's why I'm a volunteer digger. I'm getting a little old to do this, but to go and visit a dig site and find these things. I read the literature relating to archaeology, but also the manuscript artifacts. So it's been an adventure, and it has been decades, as you say, and it's just a lot of fun. And I hope I'm blessed to have a couple more decades to keep doing this kind of thing. I just find it enriching. I love to preach and get up there and, here's a story. Jesus did this or said this to somebody. It's a gospel passage. And I could really get into it, not just in my head and intellectually, but in my heart and soul, because I can understand it, pretty well. What's going on, what people are thinking and assuming, and how they would hear what Jesus says and the way they would be moved by it. And it is rewarding in preaching or teaching the same thing, where people say, wow, I never understood it like that before. I had no idea. And that as a, and you're a professor too, and that when you hear that, that's when you think, wow, the homework was worth doing, because I'm getting it across well.
Well, the church owes you a huge debt of gratitude. You've just done some wonderful work and made some important contributions. I hope viewers will pick up your book or pre-order now. It's out in a few weeks. Jesus and the Manuscripts. Personally, my dad and I are really grateful just for the continued excellent work that you are doing. So be encouraged, and viewers, pick it up. Follow what work he is doing. Dr. Craig Evans is also on Twitter. You tweet and sometimes resources and ideas that's very helpful. So definitely those watching, I hope you'll pick up a copy of Jesus and the Manuscripts. We're going to wrap up. But first, those of you who are watching, you're going to make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have some other interviews coming up you're not going to want to miss. For example, in a few weeks, we have Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas coming on together to talk about a new book coming out on the resurrection of Jesus and where historical Jesus scholarship will be. We also have Dr. William Dembski coming up, one of just the architects of the intelligent design movement, to give some reflections back on the movement and some advice moving ahead. So you're not going to want to miss some of these interviews. This is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. So if you've ever thought about studying apologetics more formally, we'd love to have you come study with us at Biola. We have a master's program. We also have a certificate program. If you just want to not quite commit to a master's, but have someone walk you through some good lectures and material and keep you accountable. All that information is below in kind of the content of this video, as well as a link to Dr. Craig Evans' book. Dr. Evans, hang on just for a moment. Don't disappear, but I want to thank all of you for joining us. This has been a wonderful, wonderful interview. We'll see you all soon.